The program was part of a long-term cognition study, mirror self-recognition across species, a protocol that had been run in primate research facilities for decades. The mirror was purpose-built, tempered, frameless, bolted flush to the enclosure wall at animal eye level, so nothing could shift or fall. The setup was clean. The question was simple: does the animal understand that the reflection is itself? The deer headbutted it until the researchers intervened. The giant panda looked in, yawned, and turned away. The African gray parrot danced in front of it for 40 minutes, as though it had finally found its ideal audience. Every species had its own way of not understanding what a mirror was. Then came the macaque troop. 11 individuals responded as expected, curious, then indifferent, then gone. The 12th came to the mirror after the others had left. His name in the records was Kaibo, male, 4 years old. He looked into the mirror and recognized himself. Then he stopped. His eyes moved slowly to the empty space behind his left shoulder. He placed his hand against the glass at that exact point. He pressed his cheek to his own hand. He closed his eyes. He waited. Nothing came. He lowered his hand. He turned and walked away. The next morning, he came back to the mirror. He looked at his reflection. He looked at the empty space behind his left shoulder. He waited. Nothing came. He turned and walked away. He did this every morning for 3 days before the research team flagged the footage. No one in the control room could explain it. Only one person could. And that person had not been present for 4 years. There is a road that runs along the edge of the Nagano forest line, where the trees grow close enough to the shoulder that in summer the canopy closes overhead and you drive through a tunnel of green. In winter, the branches are bare and the snow fills the ditches and the road becomes a gray thread between walls of white. Tanaka Hiroshi drove it 312 days a year. He knew its rhythms the way you know a commute the curve. Where the deer crossed in October, the frozen patch by kilometer marker 7 that never melted before March. The place where the cell signal dropped out for 40 seconds, regardless of weather or season. He was a forestry engineer, which meant his job was to observe and document and not to intervene. The forest had its own logic. He trusted it. That was the first week of April, 4 years and 8 months ago. The storm had come through 2 nights earlier and left the kind of silence that follows real weather, not peace, but suspension. Tanaka had pulled off at the access road to check a drainage channel that had blocked twice already that season and walked the edge of the embankment with a flashlight, not because he needed it, but because the early dark made the distance hard to judge. He heard it before he found it. A sound small enough to ignore, small enough that he almost did. It was coming from a hollow where a beach had come down and torn open a cavity in the root system, the kind of shelter that looks like intention, but is only geometry, a gap that happened to face away from the wind. He reached in with the flashlight and saw fur. The macaque was smaller than his fist, eyes sealed shut. Its mouth was open, but most of the sound wasn't reaching the air. He could feel the cold coming off it before he touched it. The mother was not nearby. He knew what that meant. He had seen enough seasons in this forest to know what it meant when something this small was alone and this cold and making a sound this quiet. He stood there for a moment with the flashlight. Then he took off his flannel jacket, the heavy one, the one he wore when the work ran late, and he wrapped the animal in it and carried it back to the truck. He did not think ahead further than that. He sat in the truck with the heat on for 20 minutes before the shivering slowed. He had his phone in his hand with the wildlife rescue number already searched. He looked at the number. He looked at the animal in his jacket on the passenger seat. The macaque's mouth was still moving. He put the phone down. He drove home. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that faced a parking lot. It was not a large apartment, a kitchen, a room where he slept, a bathroom with a frosted window, a narrow balcony where he kept his boots. He had lived there for 6 years and had never once thought about it as a place where anything unexpected might happen. He sat on the sofa with the animal against his chest, still in the jacket, and looked at the wall. He was not making a decision. He was waiting to see what the next hour required. The next hour required warmth. So he sat and provided that. By midnight, he understood that he could not put the animal down. Not because it resisted, it was too weak to resist anything, but because every time the contact broke for more than a few seconds, the sound started again. Not loud, not dramatic, just a thin, persistent frequency that his body responded to before his mind caught up. He sat on the sofa through the night with his back against the armrest and the animal on his chest. He watched the parking lot lights through the window. A cat moved along the wall at 2 in the morning. A truck pulled in and idled and left. The sky went from black to gray to a color that wasn't quite either. Kibo was still breathing. That was sufficient. Tanaka stood up very slowly and went to make coffee. The first week was a sequence of problems solved in order. Formula researched at 2 in the morning on his phone one-handed while the animal slept against his shoulder. Temperature the vet clinic 3 towns over asked no questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Feeding interval every 2 hours, including through the night. He set an alarm on his phone and a backup alarm and learned to wake at the first. He learned to prepare the bottle in the dark without turning on the kitchen light. Because the light woke the animal, and a woken animal was harder to settle. He learned the difference between the sound that meant hungry and the sound that meant something else. A subtler frequency that seemed to mean only that contact had been interrupted and needed to be restored. He became fluent in this distinction faster than he expected. He told no one. He had never owned anything. Not a plant, not a fish, nothing that required another creature to survive. In the second week, he understood that this was not a neutral fact. It was a space that had been waiting. He focused on the problems in order. By the end of the first month, Kibo weighed 430 grams and could sit upright without assistance. His eyes had opened in the second week dark brown, very still with a quality of attention that Tanaka found difficult to describe, except to say that when Kibo looked at him, it did not feel like being observed by an animal. It felt like being assessed. He passed, apparently. Kibo slept on his chest every night. During the day, he rode in the front pocket of Tanaka's work vest, which Tanaka had modified with a piece of fleece cut from an old blanket. The modification was crude and took him 3 attempts to get right, and he was unreasonably pleased with the result. He did not think about this pride. He simply felt it. The law was not abstract to him. He was a government employee who worked in resource management, which meant he knew exactly which regulations he was violating and by how much. He had known from the night he drove home. The knowledge sat in a specific part of his mind. Not suppressed, not ignored, just placed there where he could see it clearly and choose to continue anyway. He had no argument for this choice that would have survived scrutiny. The animal needed him. He was there. These 2 facts precluded the other facts for as long as he let them. The third month was when things acquired texture. Kibo had learned the apartment and its distances, the exact length of the kitchen, the gap between the sofa and the wall, the height of the windowsill where the afternoon light came in at an angle he seemed to prefer. He had opinions about furniture arrangement communicated through a system of graduated protests that Tanaka had learned to interpret with some accuracy. He disliked the television above a certain volume. He approved of the space under the desk and would install himself there while Tanaka wrote reports, occasionally reaching up to touch the back of Tanaka's ankle in a way that served no practical purpose. Tanaka allowed this. He began to find the evenings quieter when it didn't happen. It was in the third month that the peekaboo began. It did not begin deliberately. Nothing that mattered between them began deliberately. The bathroom had a full-length mirror bolted to the wall beside the door, standard issue, the kind that came with the apartment. Tanaka had barely registered it in 6 years. Kibo registered it immediately. The first encounter was an ambush. He came around the door, saw the animal in the mirror, and launched himself at it with a sound that brought Tanaka in from the kitchen at speed. He found Kibo pressed against the mirror's surface, patting at it urgently, looking around behind it for the intruder that was not there. Tanaka sat on the edge of the tub and watched. The attacks on the mirror continued for 3 days. They decreased in frequency and intensity by a consistent gradient. On the 4th day, Kibo approached the mirror, slowly sat down in front of it, and looked at the animal inside it for a long time. Then he raised one hand and touched his own cheek, looked at his hand, looked back at the mirror, touched his cheek again. Tanaka was standing in the doorway with his toothbrush in his hand. He understood in a general way that what he was watching was rare, that the capacity to recognize oneself in a mirror was something only a small number of species on Earth possessed. What he had was the particular feeling of being present for something that did not require an audience, but that changed slightly by being witnessed. He stood very still. After that, the mirror became infrastructure. Kibo would sit on the edge of the basin, while Tanaka brushed his teeth, a habit that established itself without negotiation, simply by repeating until it was expected. 2 reflections in the same frame each morning. Tanaka had spent 6 years looking into that mirror alone. He noticed the difference without naming it. The morning it changed was a Tuesday in late August, overcast, with the kind of flat light that makes everything look slightly muted. Tanaka was brushing his teeth. Kibo was on the basin edge looking into the mirror in the thoughtful way he had developed, not at his own reflection specifically, but at the whole field of it, the composition of the bathroom behind them both. Tanaka does not know what made him do what he did next. He stepped to the left, out of frame. The mirror held only Kibo now. 2 seconds. Then Tanaka leaned back in from behind Kibo's left shoulder, from the upper left corner of the mirror's field, the place you'd look for someone approaching from behind, and made a small sound. Not a word, just a breath, sound, a click of the tongue. Kibo startled, looked around behind him. Nobody there. Looked back at the mirror, tilted his head. Tanaka brushed his teeth, did not repeat it. But the next morning, without planning to, he did it again. Step left out of frame, leaned back in from behind the left shoulder. Kibo startled less. On the 3rd morning, Kibo did not startle at all. He had been watching the upper left quadrant of the mirror since Tanaka began brushing his teeth. He was waiting. Tanaka appeared. Kibo made a sound, short, percussive, and reached back to touch Tanaka's arm. The game was established. For 5 months, Tanaka did not miss a single morning. Rain mornings, early departure mornings, mornings when he was sick and moved slowly. He stepped left, leaned in from behind. The shoulder appeared in the corner of the mirror where Kibo was already looking. He did not think of it as a ritual. It was just what happened in the morning. But 5 months of what just happens every morning without exception is something other than habit. It is the texture of a day. It is the shape a life makes when it knows what to expect. Kibo had learned that shape at the level where things are known before they are understood, where the body turns before the mind gives instructions. At the time, Tanaka was simply a man brushing his teeth, while an animal waited in a mirror for something certain to arrive. The neighbor below them was a retired postal worker named Fujimoto, whose tolerance for noise, above a certain level, was limited. Tanaka had managed the situation through careful acoustics, a rug over the hardwood, a rolled towel along the bottom of the balcony door. In month 7, Kibo discovered the balcony. It was not large enough for anything except boots and a folding chair, but it had a railing with horizontal bars and a view of the parking lot and a bird population that Kibo assessed with professional intensity. Tanaka brought the folding chair out on evenings when the weather allowed. They sat together in the cold and watched the parking lot darken. He began to understand that this was something he would tell someone someday, if he could find the person to tell. The 8th month was November. Kibo weighed 1.4 kilograms and had the broad, expressive face of a juvenile male Japanese macaque, the dark eyes, the flush of pink along the cheekbones. When he was warm, the small, precise hands that were capable of astonishing dexterity. He could open most containers in the kitchen. He had developed preferences in food that were distinct and not always explicable. He would not eat anything orange, accepted apple only in specific slices, was unreasonably fond of the miso paste on the bottom shelf of the refrigerator. Tanaka moved the miso paste to the upper shelf. Kibo located it within a day. Tanaka moved it to the top shelf. He was losing. He found this funnier than he expected. He had stopped thinking about making the call. Not because he had decided against it, but because the decision had been superseded by so many mornings that it no longer occupied the same space in his thinking. It was still there. He knew it was still there. He simply looked at the animal on his chest in the evenings and thought about the next day's work report, and the question waited in the corner where he had put it. The wildlife management officer was named Inoue. He was not unkind. He arrived at 8:15 on a Wednesday morning with a colleague who stayed near the door and said very little. Tanaka opened the door and knew immediately. Not from their uniforms. He had known people in those uniforms his whole working life. He knew from the specific way Inoue held himself the particular quality of a person about to inform you of something they expect you to resist. Tanaka did not resist. He said, "I know." He said, "I've known from the beginning." Inoue said, "We received a complaint." Tanaka nodded. He stepped back from the door. Kibo was on the sofa. He had been asleep there when the knock came and had woken with the alertness of a creature that understood context. The specific attention of someone who senses that something in the room has shifted. He looked at Inoue. He looked at Tanaka. He made the quiet sound that meant contact had been interrupted and needed to be restored. Tanaka went to the sofa and sat down without being asked. He did not look at the officers. He sat with his hands in his lap, while Kibo moved up his arm to his shoulder. He said, "Can I have 10 minutes? Not a question." Inoue looked at him for a moment. Then he said yes. The bathroom was where his feet took him. He did not plan it. He walked down the short hallway and into the bathroom because it was the room he knew best. With Kibo, the room where the mornings happened, where the mirror was, where the game lived. He stood in front of the mirror. Two reflections looked back. Kibo sat in the crook of his arm, watching the mirror with the settled attention he had always brought to it, home-specific, a little removed. Tanaka looked at his own reflection. He did not look like anything in particular. He looked like a man in a bathroom at 8 in the morning, unshaven, in a work shirt he had put on an hour ago without thinking about it. He looked ordinary. He had never been aware of this before. He was very aware of it now. He set Kibo down on the edge of the basin. The familiar place. Kibo settled into it without looking away from the mirror. He did what he always did. Looked at his reflection, looked at the field around it, turned his attention with a quality that was almost relaxed to the upper left corner. He was waiting. He was doing what 5 months of mornings had made inevitable. Tanaka stood in the mirror beside him. His reflection was there. He stood still and watched Kibo wait for him to move. He did not move. Not left, not out of frame. He stood exactly where he was and watched his reflection stand exactly where it was and watched Kibo watch the corner and did not step into it. If he stepped out and came back in one more time, he could not do the next thing. He understood this. He stood still. He placed his hand on Kibo's back for a moment, one moment flat-palmed, feeling the warmth there. He took his hand away. He turned from the mirror. He left the bathroom door slightly open. He went to the balcony. The sound Kibo made was not long. It was not loud. It was the contact frequency, the one that meant interrupted the one Tanaka had become fluent in at 3 in the morning in the first week. He stood on the balcony with his hands on the railing and heard it from the bathroom. 4 seconds. 5. Then it stopped. He stood and looked at the parking lot below and listened to the quiet inside. Then he heard the officers moving. He heard the carrier they had brought. He heard the specific sound of a door latch. He went back in after they had gone. He stood in the bathroom in front of the mirror. One reflection. He stood very still, and looked at it. Then he looked at the upper left corner, the place where Kibo always looked, the place that was always full. It was empty. He looked at it for a while. Then he turned off the light and went to make coffee. The keeper who received Kibo at the Nagano Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was Ogawa Yuki, 34 years old, a specialist in primate behavioral recovery. She had been doing this work for 9 years and was not given to sentimentality about it, which was a quality the job required and which she had developed without losing the other thing. The job also required the capacity to be fully present to what she was looking at. Kibo arrived in a standard-issue carrier with his medical records and a single-line notation at the bottom of the intake form. Separation response significant on handover. 1 sentence. In the first 3 days, Kibo did not permit contact. He sat at the back of the holding enclosure with his arms around his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, and when she moved toward him, he moved away with a precision that suggested it was not fear, but preference. He was not afraid. He simply did not want to be touched by someone who was not the person he was waiting for. She gave him time. She was good at giving things time. On the 4th day, she sat near the enclosure without moving toward it. She had a form she needed to fill out routine documentation. She sat and wrote and was aware in her peripheral vision of Kibo watching her. She did not look up. After 40 minutes, he moved from the back of the enclosure to the side closer to where she was sitting. Not close, but closer. She wrote her form. After another 20 minutes, she heard a sound from the enclosure. The short percussive sound she had catalogued in macaques as social contact. Not a demand, not a greeting exactly, just an announcement of presence. She looked up. He was looking at her. She said very quietly, "I hear you." She went back to her form. It was not rehabilitation. It was just the beginning of the long work of being in the same space without requirement. 4 years passed. Kibo joined the troop enclosure in month 2 and integrated with a steadiness Ogawa had not entirely expected, not without difficulty, but with a fundamental adaptability that suggested a robustness of character. He became mid-ranking, which in macaque social structure meant he had enough social skill to navigate without being either dominant or marginal. He groomed and was groomed. He participated in the collective thermoregulation of the troops' morning huddles with what appeared to be genuine commitment. In 4 years, Ogawa had no reason to write his name in any report for any reason other than routine observation. She was pleased about this. There was one thing she noticed, but did not record. It was too minor to record. In the early mornings, when the enclosure was still quiet and the troop had not yet dispersed from their sleeping cluster, Kibo would move to a specific point near the observation glass. The glass had a slight curvature in the lower panels that created a reflective quality in certain light conditions, not a true mirror, more a shimmer, a muted echo of the shapes in front of it. He would stand there for 3 or 4 minutes, looking into the reflection, not at the troop behind him, not at the world outside the glass, at the reflection at his own shape in it. And then, and this was the thing she noted and did not write down, his eyes would move to the upper left corner of the glass. He would look there for a moment. Then he would turn and go about his day. She saw it for the first time in year 1 and thought interesting. She saw it in year 2 and thought he still does this. She saw it in year 3 and thought I should write this down. She did not. In year 4, she stopped having thoughts about it and simply noted it as she noted the other constants, the small rituals that accumulate in a life until they are indistinguishable from the life itself. 4 years. The experiment was a standard behavioral cognition study, mirror self-recognition, a well-established protocol. A portable mirror was placed in the enclosure at 8 in the morning while the troop was occupied with the morning feed. This was the study that produced the footage Ogawa would later send to Tanaka without explanation. 11 animals reacted predictably. 2 were indifferent. 3 were briefly aggressive, 4 showed exploratory interest and then lost interest. 2 showed the contingency testing, touching the mirror, touching their faces, making the connection that the protocol was designed to detect. Textbook results. The coordinator was satisfied. Then Kibo came to the mirror. He came after the others had dispersed, which she noted because it was unusual most individuals investigated novel objects early rather than late. He moved toward the mirror at a pace that wasn't cautious exactly, but deliberate. He sat down in front of it. He looked at his reflection. Then, he looked at the empty space behind his left shoulder in the mirror. He raised his hand. He pressed it to the glass at that point, not to his own reflection, not to the mirror's surface directly in front of him, to the empty space, the upper left corner. He pressed his palm there and held it. Then, he turned his face to the same side and pressed his cheek against his own hand still pressed to the glass. He closed his eyes. He held this for several seconds. Then he opened his eyes, took his hand from the glass, and sat looking at the empty corner of his reflection for a long time, before he turned and walked back toward the troop. The control room was quiet. The coordinator looked at Ogawa. Ogawa was looking at the monitor. She was looking at the specific geometry of what had just happened. The hand pressed not to the self, but to the empty space beside the self. She knew what that looked like. Not as a behavioral scientist, as a person. She knew what it looked like when someone stood in front of a mirror and reached for someone who wasn't there. She found the file that afternoon. Kibo's intake documentation from 4 years ago thin because 8 months of pre-intake history was technically not their record to hold. The file began at the moment he became their responsibility and said nothing about anything before. She found the handover form. 3 signatures, a health summary, a vaccination record. 1 line of behavioral notation. Separation response significant on handover. She read the line 3 times. Then she looked at the name on the handover form. Tanaka Hiroshi, Forestry Department. She found a phone number through the department directory. She sat with it for a day. Then she called. He answered on the 4th ring. His voice was unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to receiving calls about practical matters. She said her name and the name of the center. She said, "I'm calling about an animal in our care that you transferred to us 4 years ago." There was a pause. Not long. Then he said, "Is he all right?" Not which animal. Not, "I'm not sure I remember. Is he all right?" She said yes. She said, "I wanted to ask you about the 8 months before intake, if you're willing." He said he was. She asked him to describe the living situation. He described it, the apartment, the formula, the first weeks. She asked about behavioral indicators. He described those too carefully, with the specificity of someone who had observed closely. She took notes. She asked about the mirror. He paused again, longer this time. He said, "There was a game." He told her about this bathroom, about the mornings, about stepping out of the frame and appearing from behind the left shoulder. He told her about 5 months of not missing once. He told her slowly in the order it had happened, the way a person tells something they have held for a long time without opportunity to say it. She put her pen down somewhere in the middle of it. She did not pick it up again until he had finished. When he stopped speaking, she sat for a moment. Then she said, "Can I send you something?" He said yes. She sent the footage from the mirror study. She sent it without annotation, without explanation. She waited. The reply came 40 minutes later. 4 words. "He's waiting for me." She read the message and did not respond immediately. She sat with it. 4 years and 8 months. 4 years since the last morning in that bathroom, 8 months before that, of the same thing every day, without exception. She was not a person who used words like memory loosely. There were arguments about encoding, about retrieval, about the degree to which absence could be represented in a mind without language. She was aware of the arguments. She was also a person who had just watched a 4-year-old macaque stand in front of a mirror and press his hand to the place where someone used to appear. She did not know exactly what that was. She knew it was not nothing. She called Tanaka back the next day. She explained the regulations, the distinctions that mattered legally, and the ones that were discretionary. She told him what was permitted. He could come as a visitor, he could stand at the observation glass, and he could not enter the enclosure. She said this precisely without apology or bureaucratic distance. He said, "That's enough." She said, "The morning session before public hours, if you can manage the drive." He said, "I'll be there Thursday." He arrived at 7:40. Ogawa met him in the staff entrance. She had the thought, looking at him for the first time, that he looked like someone accustomed to being outside and patient, a person who had spent long hours in weather. He said, "Thank you for calling." She said, "He gave me reason to." She led him down the hall to the observation corridor. The enclosure was beginning to wake the troop, dispersing slowly from the overnight cluster, the first individuals moving toward the morning food distribution that had not yet arrived. Kibo was in the middle of the group. She watched Tanaka find him. He did not have to search for long. She had the thought that this was what recognition looked like from the outside, the small, particular stillness of a face that has located what it was looking for. She took a step back. Tanaka stood at the glass. He did not call out. He did not press close. He stood at a distance of perhaps half a meter and simply stood there in the way. He stood the specific posture of a person in a place they know. He had understood without being told that what he brought was not a sound or a gesture. It was a presence, a particular weight and way of breathing. These were the things that did not translate through glass. But they were the things he had. He offered them. Kibo was eating. He was in the middle of the enclosure with 3 other individuals working through the first distribution of the morning with the efficient focus he always applied to food. There was no change in his posture, no visible alertness. For 3 minutes, nothing happened. And Ogawa, standing at the far end of the corridor, understood that she might have been wrong about what the footage meant. That she might have imposed a narrative on behavioral data. This was a known professional risk. She was prepared to accept it. Then Kibo stopped eating. He did not look toward the glass. He did not look anywhere in particular. He simply stopped eating and raised his head and held very still. The animals beside him continued eating. He stood among them, not moving for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he looked at the glass. He came to it slowly, not running, not vocalizing, moving in the way that suggested he was approaching something that might not be real, that might be a trick of light, a thing that looked like something it wasn't and would reveal itself as empty the moment he trusted it. He was 3 years old the last time he had seen this person. But the body knows what the mind cannot name. He came to the glass and looked at Tanaka and did not look away. Tanaka did not move. He stood still and let himself be looked at. After a moment, Kibo turned not away, but sideways and looked at the glass surface itself. He found his reflection. He found it and looked at it, and then moved his eyes slowly and with purpose to the upper left corner. Tanaka understood before Kibo finished the movement. He stepped left. He stepped to the corner of the glass that Kibo was looking at, the upper left, the behind-the-shoulder place, the place that had always been his, and he stood there. In Kibo's reflection in the glass, a figure appeared at the upper left, behind his shoulder, where it had always been. Kibo went very still. He looked at Tanaka's image in the glass for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and placed it flat against the glass, against the reflection of Tanaka. Not a slap, not an exploratory touch, a placement. The deliberate held gesture of someone making contact across a distance they cannot close. Tanaka raised his hand from the other side. He put it flat against the glass where Kibo's hand was pressing. 4 centimeters of tempered safety glass between them. That was everything that was between them. Ogawa at the end of the corridor put her hand over her mouth. She did not write anything down. They stayed like that for a duration she did not measure. Long enough to be intentional. Long enough to be, in whatever sense the word applied here, a decision. Then Tanaka lowered his hand. He looked at Kibo for another moment. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He stepped back, away from the corner, out of Kibo's frame of vision in the glass. He disappeared from the reflection. He stood to the side of Kibo's sightline, invisible in the glass. Kibo looked at his own reflection and the empty corner beside it. He looked at the empty corner. 1 second, 2, 3. Tanaka stepped back in. Back to the upper left behind the shoulder. He appeared in the glass exactly where he always had. Kibo had not startled. He had turned his eyes to that corner before Tanaka finished moving. He had anticipated the way you anticipate something. You know, with the part of yourself that operates beneath anticipation. He had been waiting before there was anything to wait for. The sound Kibo made was short. It was not a sound she could locate in any vocalization catalog she knew. It was not an alarm call, not a greeting, not a contact call in the technical sense. It was the sound of something held for a long time being very briefly released. Tanaka stood in the corner of the glass and said nothing. He looked at Kibo looking at him. Then he stepped back out of frame one more time. This time he did not return. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She stepped aside to let him pass without comment. He walked toward the staff exit without stopping. At the door he paused, his hand on it for a moment. She thought he might say something. He went through the door. She went back to the observation window. Kibo was sitting in front of the glass. He had not moved from where he had stood with Tanaka. He was looking at his reflection. His reflection looked back a 4-year-old male macaque, mid-ranking, well-adjusted solitary in this particular moment. He looked at the upper left corner. He held still. He looked at the empty corner for a long time. Then he placed his hand against the glass, against the empty corner. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he took it away. He turned from the glass and walked back toward the troop. Before he reached them, he paused. He turned his head just enough to angle his vision back toward the glass. The empty corner. Then he turned away and moved into the group and was within a few seconds indistinguishable from the others. Ogawa stood at the window for some time after the troop had settled. She was looking at the lower panel of the glass, the curved section that caught the morning light and made that faint reflective shimmer the spot where Kibo stood every morning in the early quiet before the day began. She opened her notebook. She wrote one line that would not go into any formal report. He still knows where to look. She looked at what she had written. She looked at the spot on the glass. Where Kibo's hand had been still faintly warm, she imagined, though she knew this was not physically accurate. She looked at the upper left corner of the window. She pulled her chair from the corridor wall. She placed it in front of the glass, not in front of the central panel, not in the position from which a researcher ordinarily sat to make observations. She placed it in the upper left position, offset, behind the shoulder line, the position from which, if someone stood and Kibo looked into the shimmer of glass at the right angle, they would appear in the corner of the reflection. She sat down. She was not Tanaka. Kibo knew that with whatever certainty he knew anything. But the corner had been empty for 4 years. And tomorrow morning he would come to his spot and look into the shimmer and move his eyes to the upper left. She turned to a fresh page. She put her pen to the paper. Not because it would change anything. Not because she could be what that corner was supposed to hold. But because when something that small keeps looking for 4 years, the least a person can do is stop being absent.